some of the symbols used for the signs of the zodiac that became common in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Western tradition, there's long been a realization going, back to Neugebauer, I think, pointed out that the symbol for Libra was very similar to, or was the same as, the hieroglyphic Egyptian symbol for like the setting place or the Western horizon. And Winkler and others have shown that there's other parallels where the later astrological symbols for the signs of the zodiac, may have been inspired by some of the symbols that were used in hieroglyphic or in Demotic.
Right, exactly. The Libra is as the horizon. That's one that's still even kind of with us today, with that sort of bar and then the little bump like that. That could be very much the Achet, and I think, that's the one you have on the screen right there. The Sagittarius as a kind of arrow glyph also makes a lot of sense, and you can see the continuity. Some of them are not as obvious as others, and another one is maybe too obvious, but the Aquarius sign. Those are actually those wavy lines are used in hieroglyphic writing to represent water. The word mu is as a set of two or three wavy lines like that. So there's a connection there possibly, and there's also some folks like Joachim Quack, whom we mentioned earlier, have suggested that certain planetary signs might have a relationship. So that kind of pointiness of the Mars glyph might be related to the use of a knife sign. And there's also
some of the Demotic, other Demotic horoscopes use the symbol of a knife for the planet Mars.
Exactly. Yeah. So that may have evolved into some of the later glyphs. And I believe also sometimes that the sign of Venus, and we saw Venus and the name of Venus on that Dendera zodiac, who's called Panecher Dua, which is the morning god. Dua is sometimes written as a lotus sign. And so Quack has suggested that the shape of this lotus with its little stem may eventually have evolved into the sign in later manuscripts, which is less complex than the circle with the cross underneath it that we think of. It's just a circle and a line. And Quack has suggested there may have been an evolution from the Dua sign to that simplified circle and line, which is kind of antecedent to our Venus glyph that is used today. So there's a whole set of, and I think Alexander Jones also talks about some of these similarities and shows some of the notations that were used in the Greek papyri and also the manuscript tradition, and notes that the Greek papyri often use an abbreviation of some kind based on the name of the planet, but that when there's a symbol that later emerges in the early manuscript tradition and astrological manuscripts, some of those seem to be traceable back to Demotic signs. So we have that's another interesting element of the continuity of practice. These are the kinds of things that would be passed on from teacher to student, presumably, as you just, nobody talks about it, but you just learn how to write the sign for a planet or a sign of the zodiac, and they just get passed on.
Yeah, well, and I think it's really important because there's a tendency in most of the Greek material to write the planetary names out in Greek words, like use the full name, like Zeus for Jupiter or Ares for Mars, or what have you. But here in the Demotic tradition, we have a tradition of them using like a single symbol and sometimes like a pictorial representation, essentially, for some of the planets or the signs of the zodiac. And that clearly, in some instances, some of those symbols continued all the way into present day, where the Aquarius symbol is still exactly or very closely the same. I guess today it's 2 wavy lines, whereas in this tradition we're looking at, it was 3. Or the Libra symbol, like you said, is very close. But that basically means, like, the short version of that is, somebody could summarize that by saying that the Egyptians contributed the concept essentially of the astrological glyphs. And in some ways, that goes all the way back to the use of like hieroglyphs in the Egyptian tradition, much further back in the sense of using pictorial symbols in order to represent things.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's much more that ideographic writing or concept-based signs is much more of an Egyptian tradition, obviously, than a Greek tradition of writing. So just the whole idea itself. Yeah, very much.
Yeah. So just, I think that's important just in terms of thinking about this question of, especially once things get murky about, what's Mesopotamian and what's Greek and what's Egyptian in the Hellenistic period, where it's all merging together, that there may be specific pieces we can focus on and say, this is something perhaps that Egyptian culture contributed to astrology that seems a little bit more clear cut compared to other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And including some of the other things that we've already talked about today. There are elements that have antecedent traditions or that you can locate in a particular tradition of practice more generally, writing systems and styles and so forth. And those have longer prior histories and a cultural context within Egypt that tends to crystallize around temples and their writing systems. And so
Right.
a little bit more, yeah, it's good to think about all of those possibilities. I'm glad you pointed that out because we have both these multicultural, multi-ethnic milieus where there's lots of translation going on, but we also have these continuations of longstanding traditions that I won't say are unchanged or unchanging, but there's a specific institution or a social location in this world where they preserve certain kinds of practice and certain kinds of ideas.
Yeah. And so some of this material, like we said, is really just discovered very recently through the finds, through archaeological excavations in some of these cities in Egypt that are still ongoing to this day. And one of the things I've realized over recently in researching this material more is that this could be just the tip of the iceberg. Like there's probably going to be many more discoveries and other publications of other things that may change our understanding of the practice of astrology in Egypt in the first few centuries BCE and CE, just based on further finds, basically.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time, and then there's also the thing we mentioned earlier, the need to publish materials that were discovered at various times, but people haven't been able to gather the labor together to really work through these difficult texts and transcribe them and translate them and then publish commentaries on them. We do have, as I mentioned, demotic treatises that are also tables for finding the position of planets, some that include sketches of interpretive principles for various things. But there's also large numbers of ones that are reported that are in collections and just are waiting for translation to be brought to light.
Yeah, so that's really important. And it raises one of the points for me that starts getting us towards a conclusion. But I think there's things now we can start to see like the glyphs and hieroglyphs and that connection or connection demotic of using pictorial symbols. It means sometimes there's things that we take for granted in the Western tradition of astrology that we assume or that have long been assumed to go back to the Greeks and that were thought to be Greek innovations that we've taken for granted are Greek for a long time that may have actually been introduced by Egyptian astrologers or been a byproduct of Egyptian cultural things that came from Demotic or other traditions surrounding that. And so there may be other parts of the astrological tradition that have long been assumed to be Greek or what have you that may actually also come from or been Egyptian contributions, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. If we turn back again to that figure Nekepso and Petosiris, as you mentioned, it was an earlier tradition to assume that this was a Greek invention, creating a sort of authoritative figure as an author for astrological doctrines and tracing it back to Egypt because that was understood as a site of wisdom. But then, just a little while ago, a papyrus story about a priest a papyrus story in Demotic about a priest by the name of Peti Ezi, which is close to Petaceres, and may be partly a related a misunderstanding related to the way it's written in Demotic. This Petiesi in this story finds in a temple a manuscript, an old book on astrology by a certain Imhotep, and then presents it to this pharaoh, Nekepso, or Nikau Pashesh, who's the Neko the Wise, who's the historical figure. So these are, and then there follows actually an astrological text, which has some doctrines of interpretation related to the moon. So the more these Demotic texts get published, the more we sort of revise some of our understandings of the position of these things that we see in Greek texts. Some of them are, of course, going to derive from Greek tradition, but sometimes we catch these little glimpses in newly published papyri. I think that translation of that text was only published in 2019 by Kim Reiholt and Joachim Kvak again. So
Right.
new finds, new discoveries all the time.